Thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab's free online webinar. You are currently participating in From Virtual to Events and More. Here are the top trends in time and expense management, what nonprofits need to know for 2021. Questions are encouraged throughout the webinar. You may type them into the question box as they arise and they will be read by our moderator. Chris Harley is VP of Sales at Data Basics, an enterprise-grade time and expense management solution provider recognized by leading global organizations for its deep expertise, next-gen technology, and customer-focused platform, including such nonprofits as associations and philanthropy as Consortium of Oceans, the Trust for Public Land, Pathfinder International, National Quality Forum, PRA Health Sciences, and Academy of Physician Assistants. Since joining the team in 2000, Chris has held numerous roles, and today he manages business development, sales, and partner activities. With such a long tenure at Data Basics, Chris is a true time and expense expert and can provide valuable guidance and advice to organizations seeking to find a better solution for time and expense management. Chris, I'll now hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jordan, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. I guess at this point should be early afternoon or maybe late morning, depending upon where you are in the country. As Jordan mentioned, the topic today is to talk about top trends in time and expense management and the impacts and what we're seeing taking place as we move into 2021. The agenda that I was going to run through was to really just first start and talk about some of the key challenges we're seeing out there, and then talk about the technology that's put in place that can help organizations address that. I do have a quick case study that relates to an organization that here in the last 18 months or so has deployed a time and expense tool, and what their issues were and challenges were before they looked at that solution, and then of course what they're now able to do with an automated tool in place. We'll talk about the trends and what we're seeing in 2021, and of course that continues to change looking at the environment around us. And then we do have some time here at the end to talk about or to do some questions and answers. And as Jordan mentioned, if at any point during this presentation you have a question, feel free to go ahead and enter it into the toolbar there, and we'll make sure we address that at the end of this presentation. And if we don't get a chance to get around to those questions, I'll definitely make sure we address it sometime this afternoon. Either myself or someone from our team can reach out and answer any questions that you guys may have. As far as time-wise, looking to take probably 25-30 minutes or so, and then get into the Q&A. So hopefully not take up too much of your time here today, but definitely want to provide you guys some insight as far as what we're seeing out there. And really, kind of as we look at the key areas that we're going to talk about addressing here, as we look at nonprofits, the big areas that people look to tackle here is, of course, the ability to quantify and look at grants and projects out there, as certainly look at the resources we have. Organizations are, as we talk about time and expense specifically, looking to streamline some of the accounting responsibilities and the roles out there. For nonprofits, you certainly have an environment out there where, depending upon your funding source, you're required to provide information and details as it relates to where labor and other expenses are going. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to create efficiencies. And so we'll certainly get into that. Now, as Jordan mentioned, I've spent a good amount of time here at Data Basics, just about 20 years or so. For those of you that aren't familiar with Data Basics, we're based here in the greater Washington, D.C. area. Being based here, going back to really our first iteration of our platform, which came out in the late 90s, we've always worked with a good number of not-for-profits out there. Part of our core functionality is the ability to go out and to track information to grants and projects, and that not only relates to the time platform we have, but also the expense reporting platform. And over the last 20 years or so here, I certainly have worked with a few hundred nonprofits, really of all sizes and of all kind of different missions out there to support them from a time and expense perspective. And so certainly hope to provide some insight to how we're addressing those, and of course, at the end here, answer any questions there that you guys may have. Um, as far as nonprofits out there, it makes up a very large pool of workers out there. Actually, looking at some of the research out there, nonprofits are actually the third largest workforce in the United States, and that's only really behind retail and manufacturing. And looking at some of the details as far as how broad the nonprofit workforce is, if you look across the United States, and when we go out and categorize organizations and industries as major industries out there, in over half the states within the United States, the nonprofit workforce makes up 10% or more of the private workforce. So without needing to tell you guys this, there certainly are a large number of nonprofits out there. And again, the mission and the look and feel of each one may vary, but you still do have some common challenges, and that's what I want to address here. And as the other note I have on here is that what we are hearing from nonprofits is that as money is provided out there, that we're finding that organizations are asking for more and more visibility and more information about where that and how that money is being spent out there. So with that being said, I always like to kind of start these conversations with just looking at some of the key challenges out there. And as I look at organizations, they typically have, 4 key challenges. The first one starts as it relates to nonprofit is just the overall management of your workforce. And so when I think of managing the workforce, I think of federal and state laws. And when we look at time and expense, what that really comes down to is the ability to go out and to track your labor. So we look at just the daily operations as it relates to a user, as far as what information do we need to capture so that we can pay these employees, whether they're exempt, non-exempt, maybe they're interns, maybe they're contractors out there. So the overall process of just going out there and finding a way to go out and track our labor out there. Now, when we start tracking labor, what that also starts to bring into, as it relates to a payroll component, is of course leave and PTO. And so it's not always as simple as we have an employee out there who's salaried, we pay them on a whatever reporting schedule it is, and they get a paycheck. We do need to go out and to track PTO, leave. And as we go out and talk to organizations, we oftentimes see that they may have one tool in place to capture time. They may have another tool in place to capture leave, or maybe they have another process in place as it relates to the approvals and the workflows out there. So I always start with kind of the first challenge out there is the ability just to simply track what's taking place as it relates to our resources, whether those are employees or contractors or other resources out there. The next challenge out there is something there that is definitely part of all nonprofits out there is how do we go out and track information as it relates to projects and grants out there. And so I call this kind of project and grant compliance. So as we look at an individual user out there, not only are we tracking what they're doing as it relates to hours for labor, but we do need to go out and track this information as it relates to projects and grants, because ultimately we need to report this information back. Now, when it relates to a timesheet module, that is something there that you see within a lot of time platforms is, of course, the ability to go out there and to track information to a project or grant. When it gets into the expense reporting side, it does create some more complexities out there, because as people go out and travel, or maybe there are events that you are putting on where you want to go ahead and track information against, again, either a grant or maybe it's an internal project or activity, organizations want to come up with a way to streamline and simplify the tracking of this information within a time and expense. And then, of course, the audits out there. With most nonprofits, what we see is the ability for an organization to need to show they're compliant and to be able to show that they have the controls in place to make sure that those funding sources continue to provide information. So how do we do those audits? How detailed can we do those audits? And what sort of information can we look at? Now, beyond just simply looking at kind of federal and state rules and of course your project tracking, the next piece of your challenges I see is what I call organization requirements. So this is really just looking at the individual organization and the personality it has and what we look for from the individual users. And when I look at that, the first thing is, of course, internal policies out there. So, what are the rules and demands we place on our employees as it relates to time entry, as it relates to the type of leave they have, and as it relates to the expenses that they incur out there. And that's going to vary, as you all know, as I'm sure you've worked at numerous different organizations, as you see that as you move between organizations, different organizations have different internal policies. And of course, the challenge for most of you is how do we go ahead and enforce those policies, and what happens if those policies change? The next piece is what I call user demands. And so this is, as we start looking at all these pieces, what sort of feedback do we get from our users as it relates to either our policies or the tools that we have in place out there. And again, this gets into, how, what do they have to enter a timesheet every day? Do they go into Excel? Do we get a lot of pushback that we don't like the way the form works? Do we get pushback from the organization that they feel they're cracking down too much on us? And then the last piece here, which relates to individual organizations, is what I call the technology infrastructure. So these are the tools that you've put in place to manage the organization. Now, as it relates to time and expense, we're typically going to be talking about maybe a payroll tool, an HR module, of course, the accounting platform, maybe a travel booking system out there as it relates to travel. And the question is, what are those pieces, and how do they talk to each other, or do they talk to each other? And when it comes to time and expense, that's always the first thing organizations are looking for from a tool is, how do I take a time and expense tool and make it work within the ecosystem that I have in place? And I've got some examples as we get to the end of this presentation to talk about, some of the more common tools we see out there from the accounting side, the HR, the payroll, and other pieces out there. And then really the last piece, as we look at the individual industry, is what I call, or industry challenges, what I call external factors. And nothing has probably shined brighter, not in a positive sense, in the last 10 months or so than COVID-19. One of the things that we've seen here since middle of March last year is a lot of organizations really scrambling, a lot of organizations having exposure to what they either did or didn't do as it relates to the time and expense side. There's some pretty interesting stats as it relates to, the workforce with COVID-19. I don't need to tell any of you on the phone here, how it has impacted our life, both professionally and personally. But one of the interesting stats is that on March 17th, which is really kind of the Friday as the COVID-19 was really, quote, coming online within the U.S., roughly 82% of the U.S. workforce was working in offices. By the following Friday, so by March 24th, that number had dropped from 82% to 17%. So America very quickly went remote. And being remote put a lot of stress on organizations as it related to what they were doing on the time and expense front, as it related to the policies that organizations had in place, and also as it related to the platforms that an organization was leveraging to capture this information. And then the other piece I call miscellaneous. Now, truth being told, COVID-19 is kind of a very big example of what is usually those miscellaneous factors out there. And as we know from an organization perspective, there's always those things that come up that we don't really have complete control over, and it certainly impacts the way we do that. So as I look at the industry challenges out there, I always say we've got our federal rules and regulations, we've got our internal policies out there. In the case of organizations similar to you guys, we've got our project and grant tracking piece, and then we've got really external factors that come into play to impact that. So with that being said, what do we do to address these items, and is there a way to address them? And the short answer, we always say yes. And the tools that organizations are using is really using new technology to go out and do that. And when we look at technology, we do the same sort of, in the same capacity we're talking about the challenges, we do the same sort of thing as it relates to how we address organizations. And for nonprofits, really what we talk about is automation, is what part of your process can we go out and automate? We then look at what we're going to call web and mobile. So what tools are in place to make life easy on the user out there? And then the last piece of that process is looking at integration. And integration is, how do we make the tools that we're putting in place that will hopefully give us automation, how do we get those to work within the ecosystem that you have in place. And again, as we talk about that ecosystem, it's going to vary company to company as far as what pieces you have in place and what pieces you need to talk to each other. And with that being said, I really break it into a number of key goals out there. The first goal is to be able to go ahead and quantify and see what we're doing as it relates to our projects and grants and our resources. You know, how do we go out and see if the organization is operating appropriately as we look at budgets in those areas. The other piece is streamlining accounting responsibilities. Again, I don't need to mention too much about how COVID-19 has impacted organizations, but certainly as organizations went remote, how much of the accounting process was streamlined, how much more does need to be streamlined, and how can we go out and streamline this as much as possible. It's interesting on the time and expense side, how many areas that we can go out and actually automate and streamline, and I'll talk about that here in the next couple of slides, that organizations don't think about. And then even as you get into some individual features and functionality, how we can automate some of these things that, again, organizations didn't think much about. One of the big ones I talk a lot about is receipt management, is, you know, what OCR technology allows an organization to do. It's, you know, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, organizations were happy with just the fact that they could digitize a receipt. Well, today we have the ability to have a user take a picture of a receipt, have us extract the data off that receipt and pull it into the application. So a user can technically be doing an expense report by simply taking a picture of a receipt and nothing else. Basically, the application will read that information and map it back into the accounting solution. And then better reporting. I think one of the biggest areas that we talk about when we go into organizations is what sort of data are you able to get? How quickly can you get that data? And what does the data give you? One of the things I've mentioned here is, of course, we're talking about time and expense, and I'm going to talk about putting time and expense together. But many organizations say we have reporting, but that reporting is in multiple systems. And so again, I need to go one place to get time information. I need to go somewhere else to get project information. I need to go somewhere else to get expense reporting information. Well, how do I get all that information together? And again, you may even think of your accounting tool. So your accounting tool ultimately gives you that information, but it may not have the detail that you guys want. And then the last piece here is creating efficiencies. And when I talk about efficiencies, I'm really talking about the end user side. You know, how do we make it so those users can very quickly and easily get in, enter information, understand the information they're supposed to be providing, and quickly get it put off into the process so that the accounting and finance team and the HR team can go out, get that information, do what they need to do with that information, whether it's just simply approving it, and then make sure that we push all that information over into the accounting or payroll system out there so that we can complete our corporate processes out there. So if we look at those goals, and again, as you know, I know we've got different organizations sitting here on this call here today, and there may be some additional goals that you guys have, but as I look at an organization, what I always tell them is I look at the user, I look at the accounting and finance group or the managers out there, and then I look at kind of the executives. And if we can figure out how to, you know, create an efficiency for each one of those groups, we'll typically have success as it relates to these projects out there. So, so the first piece here is I talk about, you know, what can be automated. And so, you know, what we have here is, you know, some of the key components that we're looking to address as it relates to time and expense. Now, it's interesting, as you guys look at these individual items, you may have multiple systems to do this. And one of the key things we're going to talk about here is looking at a single solution to go out and do that. So when we look at this, a good time and expense system should give you the ability to go out and automate the payroll process. So of course, the ability to capture, again, whether we're talking about exempt or non-exempt employees, the ability to capture hours, the ability to capture exceptions of those hours, to track overtime, and any of the information as it relates to what you need to capture from a payroll side. The next area is paid time off or absence management or leave management out there. So if we have a process in place, if employees are accruing hours or whether they're starting the year off with a bulk sum of hours out there, most organizations have an approval process as it relates to leave and absence management. So the big question is that process automated and integrated into your time tool? And if it's integrated in your time tool, what you should be able to do is have a user go out there, request time off, he or she should be able to go in and very easily see the hours that they have accrued, if they're accruing, or the hours they have remaining. They should be able to see what categories that relates to. They should be able to quickly go out and push that off into an approval process, get approved, and then when they come in to do a timesheet, to be able to see all that information there right in the timesheet. The next piece is project or grant tracking. And again, I kind of interrelate those terms just because I know, in working with organizations similar to you guys, sometimes use the term project, sometimes grant, it depends, is, how detailed can we track this? Do we have the ability to restrict who sees what information? What happens if we have a project that has an effective date? Maybe it should only have time allocated against it for a certain time period. Maybe we have a budget. Maybe we're only should only be allocating a certain number of hours or a certain amount of funds against that particular project. So how do we go in and track that? And then the same thing on the expense reporting side. If we have someone traveling and we want to allocate those hours against a particular project or grant, how do we go in there and get that information? Compliance, and compliance relates really two areas. One, I look at internal compliance. So, what are the rules we put in place for an individual organization? Are we allowed to expense alcohol if we take, for example, an expense reporting tool? Are we allowed to, take vacation in half day increments? Can we take more than 10 days of vacation in a row? Those sort of things, which may be internal rules out there. How do we go out and capture that? And then we look at also compliance as it relates to, federal and state laws, or even project compliance out there. How do we track that information? Integration. How do we make this tool operate within the ecosystem we have? And I'll talk about that here in a second as far as that. And then reporting the analytics. How quickly can we get to information? Who has access to information? Does that include both time and expense in a single tool? What sort of notifications can we push those reports out to people? And again, how easily is it to use reporting tools? I think one of the toughest things you see from a technology, and especially talking to you from a sales side of an organization, what I've seen over the last 20 years or so is that a lot of times when organizations buy a technology tool, you have the vendor come in, someone shows you a very slick demo on how the reporting works, and people go, oh, this is great, we're going to be able to go out there and run all these reports and get up to all this data. And then what they find is that when the tool is finally given to them and it's been deployed and put in production, is that in fact the reporting tool that looked very simple when the person was demonstrating it to us isn't in fact very intuitive. And so that organizations aren't able to get to the information they want to get to. And so when I talk about reporting and analytics, it's making sure that you can not only get to the data, but the people that need to get to the data are able to do that in a very easy to use fashion. And then the last piece is employee satisfaction. It's under my tab here of why automate. But ultimately, employees are expecting more from the technology they deploy. Again, I can tell stories about being around organizations, 15, 20 years ago, and they didn't really care about the employees' input. But today, as employees go out and use their phones or their mobile devices for really everything, they start to ask the organization, well, why can't I do my timesheet on my phone? Or why can't I capture receipts more easily on my phone? And so certainly putting in place a tool that raises your employee satisfaction is critical. And then the other piece out there is that, we continue to see organizations are starting to look at the technology they're using as part of their corporate personality out there. They want to be cutting edge. They want to make sure that they're showing the employees that they care about the tools they're putting in place. So that employee satisfaction is really important. So, so once we automate, what are we able to do? And so I've got a couple of things to look at here. So first and foremost, let's talk about how we improve the user experience. A good time and expense tool that's deployed for a nonprofit is going to give your employees the ability to access and do timesheets and expense reports from anywhere on any device. There's no need for a user to have to drag a laptop around or go into the office to be able to enter time or expenses. They should be able to get to that, again, no matter where they are in the world. And what it should provide them is a very simple and clean user experience out there. Now, beyond just simply being able to access that anywhere, of course, we look at employees going remote, that is critical, but also employees being out there on the road. in addition to be able to access anywhere, the solution should also be able to do push notifications. So again, if we've got a question about someone's expense report, if someone is curious about whether they're going to be reimbursed in a certain time frame or their leave was approved, we should be able to have real-time notifications that go out to these users so they can very quickly and easily see that information. The next one is the pre-population of data. I think that's probably the number one thing I hear when I go out and talk to organizations that are looking to automate their time and expense solution, which is not only do we want to make it easy for the user, but why can't we just put in front of the user the information that's critical to them, and make sure that we're not putting in place a process that is kind of as a user goes in, I shouldn't have to see all the grants within the entire organization. I should only see the grants that I need to see and make sure that quickly gets the information in there. And then also talk about simple project and grant tracking. Again, we should be able to have the ability to have templates in there to pre-fill information. We should have the ability to quick type information, and I should have the ability to also see what my leave balance is if I'm going to go in and submit a leave request. So ultimately, what we want to provide is a better user experience out there, and we can certainly do that with the time and expense solution today. The next one is better control. So this starts getting into, as we start looking at, an organization deploying a solution, how do we go out and make sure that the users understand what the rules are? And then the other piece is, how do we enforce those rules out there? And so with an automated time and expense platform, what we can do is we can automate notifications. We can capture information real time. So as we sit here on a midday Wednesday, I can go out and I can see exactly the number of hours that have been put in for an individual project or grant. I can open up and I can very easily see who's on leave this week or who was on leave last week. I can also go out, and as it relates to budgets, I can see, what are my committed funds and what are my outstanding funds as it relates to that information. So when you put time and expense together, you're going to get much better control, but you're also going to be able to see this in a 360-degree view, and you'll be able to see the information in real time. And then what you're also going to be able to do is to go out and to run very quickly and look at compliances and audits. And so, one of the big areas we talk about is, of course, if people go in to make modifications to timesheets, who made that modification? When was it made? Or on the approval side, someone says, well, I submitted my timesheet, I don't know why it hasn't been approved. Well, you can very quickly go into the application and see exactly who's approved it, when it was approved. And again, there's no there's no way to go in there and say, oh well, I did it when in fact I didn't actually do it. So you can see all that information. And then the other piece there, and this depends on the type of organization where you're doing work, is the localization out there. If you're, again, it may be as simple as having employees in the U.S. and Canada or other parts of North America, or you may be a truly global organization out there. The ability to go out and to put in place an application that's going to be localized to the individual user. So if you've got someone in the UK and they're doing their expense report, the expenses that are being inputted in British pounds, the date formats match up to what they're used to seeing, or maybe if you've got users in Mexico, they can go ahead and access the application in Spanish. So you can automate all this, and ultimately it's going to provide you better control, better visibility, which will ultimately create a streamlined process and efficiencies. And then the last piece there is integration. And I've got just kind of a sample and some of the common tools that we look to integrate. I mentioned the term, the IT ecosystem or your IT infrastructure out there. With time and expense, we're always going to be integrating this application into this ecosystem you have in place. And so if let's just talk about a time tool. What we would typically do with our platform is we would look at where employee and project information originates within an organization. So you may be using a tool like, Microsoft Dynamics, or you may be using Intacct or Blackbaud or someone else out there. We would typically integrate our application so it could pick up that information from that tool, pull it into our application. Within our application, the user would have the ability to go in and again, allocate hours, allocate their time, enter their expenses, capture their receipts, and then it would then go off to be approved within our platform, and then we would turn around and push that information back into a back-end tool, whether that would be someone like an ADP or a Ceridian or Workday for payroll purposes, maybe for reimbursement purposes, and of course it would typically go back into the accounting solution for any of the data that you need to track back into the ledger or in your chart of accounts out there. So as we look at this process, there's no need or no reason that your time and expense platform shouldn't be tightly coupled with all the other pieces you have in place. And when I say tightly coupled, that doesn't mean that someone has to manipulate data between interfaces, or someone needs to go in there and delete columns before they upload it into the accounting tool. But in fact, this application and this process should be completely streamlined from beginning to end. Again, so if we look at, like, for example, I'll just take, for example, the Data Basics platform. If we're working with a nonprofit that's leveraging, let's just say, Microsoft Dynamics, and maybe they've got ADP for payroll, the idea is that a user or the organization should have the ability to set those users up within either ADP or within Dynamics. That information is going to automatically flow into our tool. Our tool is going to go out there and give the customer the ability to go out there and to capture their leave, have the workflows, capture the labor, and then once it's approved, it would automatically flow back into ADP and to Dynamics. And no one's having to manipulate data. It's a matter of just basically doing reviews and then moving that information automatically back into the accounting solution. So ultimately, you know, why are we looking to automate time and expense? We keep coming back to the fact we want to provide a better experience for your users and your administrators. And when we talk about the users, that doesn't simply just mean employees of the organization. Oftentimes in nonprofits, you've got board members, you've got interns, you've got contractors out there. It is possible to go ahead and put those, quote, users on the platform as well. So if you're bringing board members in for quarterly conferences or meetings out there, which I know right now are mostly being done remotely, but when we go back to the point that we are doing that, it is possible to go out there and have a board member submit his or her expenses through the platform. So you don't have to have a separate process out there where, again, I talk about, you know, interns or you know, summer, you know, help out there. You have the ability to do that. If you can get all that information into the solution, you ultimately have a better decision-making tool where you can see information as it relates to budgets, labor, policies, and all the rest of that. The other piece about this is the tool is also going to give you flexibility. So I didn't talk too much about that, but you certainly would have the ability to make changes and adjustments, to see the impact of those changes and adjustments, and to let those users know what those changes and adjustments are. And we get into trends here in a minute. I'll talk about some of the flexibility, especially as it relates to what we're seeing here with organizations, you know, over the last 10 months or so. Better control, that really kind of goes back to the better decision-making tools out there. Again, if you can get to information, get to detailed information, get information in the hands of the people who need to see that information, you're ultimately going to be able to make better decisions out there. And then really the last piece here is combining a time and expense and leave tool into one platform. Many organizations that we go talk to are using two different solutions for time and expense. And so if you can take and put that into a single platform, not only does it give you the ability to you know, have the user have one app out there, it allows you to combine the data to see that data better. But then there's just general overall cost savings. You're not paying for two solutions. You're not paying for two different maintenance plans. You're not having to deal with two different support groups. You're really just using a single vendor and a single view as it relates to that application. So with that, I want to kind of do just kind of a quick case study because we've been talking about, you know, the challenges that are out there. And again, these challenges aren't, you know, really kind of grow across the entire industry out there. But one of them that I want to do a quick case study on, that I've got some details on here, is LifeWorks. And Data Basics, if you guys are looking for more detailed information here, we're happy to provide you, you know, we've got a more detailed case study we can provide in LifeWorks. But they're a nonprofit in Minnesota. They employ a couple thousand employees out there. They actually do what is almost like a home health care. They provide a service where their employees go out into individual houses and provide assistance and daycare for elderly staff. For, let's say if one of us had an elderly parent living here and we needed to go to work, what LifeWorks does is they provide someone who can come in here and provide that in-house daycare while other folks in the while other people in the house go off to work out there. And their challenge was that they were trying to capture the information very basically, just trying to capture time information as it relates to individual users. Now, the challenge with those users is they were all over the state. And what they would do is they would go out to a house, which they basically looked at as a client, and would spend, a few hours there. And the challenge was that those users were basically capturing that time and either put it into an Excel spreadsheet or put it onto a piece of paper. And so to say the least, the system was not user friendly, but ultimately what it didn't do for the organization is it didn't have any integration into their accounting and finance system. And so as these users went out and captured that time, they may also had expenses, so they may have mileage or they may have meals and not huge expenses, but they had expenses out there. What would happen is someone would have to capture that information, collect it, and mail it into a home office for a user. Then would have to go in, key that information into a solution, and then ultimately upload that into their accounting platform. What Data Basics did is we came in and showed them the ability for us to go in and actually enter all that information on a mobile device. Now, what they didn't think about at the time, but they ultimately deployed, was that not only were they able to go in there and quickly and easily capture the hours from that user, but on the mobile device, they could also see the location of the user. So if someone was clocking in at a person's house at 8 in the morning, they could actually go in there when they would clock in on their mobile device. It would actually capture the location of it. So they had an audit trail. If anyone ever came back to dispute those hours, they could say, this is exactly where that person captured that hour. Here's how long they were there. They were also able to go in and enter expenses with the mileage, and within our mileage platform, they could do the Google GPS basically tracking. So we'd pick that information up, and they were basically able to take the time that a timesheet went from being, quote, submitted, which is basically being mailed or collected by someone regionally, and then ultimately input it. That time was basically taking about a week to week and a half. They went from doing, basically 7 to 10 days from the time it was submitted to the time it was entered, and an ability to do it within a matter of hours, where they could basically tell the users on, X day, on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, these timesheets need to be submitted. The user could do that, and they were basically ready to post that information within a matter of hours out there. And again, there are some additional details that I can certainly provide you on this. We've got a more formal case study that will be coming out, and so we're happy to share that with you. And so ultimately, when we came back and asked, LifeWorks, what was the response from the users and the administrators of the system, of course, and again, some of this is kind of, understated to say it's more intuitive and easier. What they were ultimately most proud of is that they felt that they were taking their user force and instead of burden them with administrative tasks and duties, what they believe is that ultimately they were able to go out there and to allow their users to go back in and focus on their core mission, which was to provide this service to this in-home daycare for these users, again, without being burdened on having to go through their processes, which are mostly made up of Excel and paper processes out there. So again, I won't spend too much time talking about that here today, but really just want to wrap up here with a couple items here as we talk about trends for nonprofits. So, this is what we're hearing from our customers out there as far as what they're focusing on here, as we come into 2021. Now, interesting enough, a lot of what we are seeing from our customers is a result of, COVID-19 and some of the challenges that imposed on individual organizations. And so, the first part is being connected. And when they say stay connected, what they want to be able to do is to make sure that their users or their employees, if they're at home, understand that the organization understands the challenges that are out there, and that that the organization is making sure that they're putting in place the proper solutions out there. So when we say embrace innovative solutions, what we are hearing is organizations are coming to us to say, hey, we want to put these tools in place because we want to make life as easy on our employees as possible. We want to make sure that, again, they're not being bogged down with archaic processes as it relates to time and expense. But in addition to that, as we talk about the Stay Connected side, they do also use some of our messaging technology to, again, make sure employees understand, hey, this is what we've done. We've made some changes and adjustments, and this is why it's taking place. And then, of course, the focus on transparency. One of the things that we saw from the leave management perspective is that a lot of organizations struggled as COVID-19 impacted us more and more, is they struggled with, what do we do with leave? Are we an organization that has a use it or lose it policy? Are suddenly all of our employees going to go on vacation for the last 6 weeks of the year because they haven't been able to go to the beach or take vacations? Are they suddenly going to use it? And so as they were making adjustments to their processes, one of the big things that we were seeing is make sure you're transparent with your users, open with their communications, and make sure they understand why those changes are being made. The next piece out there is, we say remain agile while staying true to your mission, and increase flexibility to move new platforms. Again, we see a lot of organizations that have come to us here in the last 10 months or so that are looking to leverage some of the changes that they're taking place, but they don't have the technology to do that. The leave management one is probably the one that we had most questions about and most support inquiries about over the last, I say the last 10 months, because organizations were saying to users, hey, what we'd prefer you guys to do is maybe take 2 days off every month so that you're using some of that leave. Even if you're just spending it with your family in the house or locally, but we'll make it up for you in 2021. We'll allow you to roll over more hours out there. So, but as they were making these policy changes, the challenges were the technology they had in place wouldn't support that. And so as we look at that, let's make sure we have the technology in place to be able to support that. And again, that's where we look at kind of increasing the flexibility and telling the users, hey, this is why we're making that change and this is how we're going to support it. And then really the last piece here is revise expense and time policies. I mentioned, leave management was probably the #1 question that we had, or #1 inquiry we were getting, in the last 10 months or so as it related to organizations looking for ways to better manage their leave, make adjustments to their leave, implement new accrual models, figure out how to roll over, or even as we saw challenges with employees who maybe had COVID or had family members had COVIDs, they were looking for ways for employees to go ahead and to share leave. Maybe I was going to take 3 of my days off and give it to another coworker so that that person could have additional days off to support with some paid time off. So leave was #1. The next one is revising expense and time policies, and especially around the expense reporting side. Again, I probably don't need to tell you guys this, but as employees move to the house there and stop traveling, we saw new expenses taking place. We saw organizations that were providing per diems to users for buying, items for their home office. Maybe they're buying paper, maybe they're buying printers. Maybe they need to buy a chair or a light or a camera or a new laptop. So we're seeing a lot of new expenses that are being incurred within organizations. One of the interesting things there, as you look at expenses, we were just looking at, I saw a report at the end of December of where our expense volume was. In March, our total expense reporting volume had dropped to about 49% of what it was the prior, I should take back, April had dropped about 49% of what it was the prior April. In December, our expense reporting volume was back up to 78% of what it was for December of 2019, which is interesting. And it's not so much that people are traveling. We're just seeing a lot of home expenses coming through the application. And again, those things may be things like paying for home Wi-Fi, allowing employees to get Grubhub or some other item out there. So definitely look at your new expense policies and make sure you have a tool that can leverage those. Emphasize the mobile apps. Again, from a mobile platform, everything I've talked about today can certainly be done on a mobile piece. and then ultimately figure out how to gain savings out there. When we look at automating time and expense, it's a very easy sell as we go into organizations because the ROI is very quick, because ultimately we can see that there are hard cost savings as it relates to reducing labor and effort as it relates from the accounting and finance side. But then there's also soft savings as it relates to reducing the effort by the user, and then ultimately creating not only efficiencies, but increasing the user satisfaction. So, to kind of wrap this all up, the challenges you guys have, are I won't say they're 100% unique to nonprofits, but certainly, what you're looking at from a grant and compliance perspective is somewhat unique out there. But the other pieces out there definitely relates to, again, looking at your organization requirements. There certainly is technology out there to support everything we've talked about today. There are ways for us to automate the process from beginning to end, which will provide efficiencies for users, for your administrators, and as well provide the visibility for executives. And again, those benefits are going to impact each one of those groups out there. The user is going to have increased satisfaction. The folks that are administrating this process are going to have increased satisfaction, and ultimately the individuals that want to see data and get compliance will be able to have satisfaction as well. So with that, let me turn the floor over to any questions that you guys may have. And I'll also take a drink of water here because I've been talking here for a bit. So let me turn it over. I don't know if Jordan's on or Lisa's on now moderating to see if there's any questions there that the group may have.
Thanks, Chris. We've got some attendees writing in, so we'll just give them a minute or two. I do see one coming through, and that is, do you have any examples of good transparency?
Yeah, so and again, transparency comes in a couple different areas when we typically talk to organizations. So, we look at transparency from the perspective of the application perspective. So, when are users entering information, who's approving, everything that takes place, and I can speak to our application, has a time and date stamp as it relates to when something takes place. So we look at transparency from that side. The next piece out there is looking at overall reporting and details. And again, you can look at this and dig into both time and expense. So as we look at expense reporting, and again, I'll use an example of transparency into, what did we spend for, our annual conference. When organizations go into the expense tool and track all those expenses back to, in this case, we'll talk about the annual conference. We can see, what was the airfare, the hotel, the cars, the meals, the mileage, the tips, and all the rest of that. So we can very quickly and easily get into that information and see, the details down to the individual user as far as who is spending what where. And again, you can say the same sort of thing on the time side. So I know the transparency is kind of a broad term out there. And again, if whoever's asking that question, if I'll certainly provide my contact details and we could, have a separate conversation. But we typically see the transparency. It depends on what you're looking for, transparency. But again, it comes in a couple different flavors out there. But the big thing that we're trying to do is to make sure that, and again, it depends on who the person is and what they're looking for, that they should be able to see everything that took place as it relates to time, projects, expenses, labor, and leave from really the beginning of the process to the end of the process out there.
Thank you, Chris. We've got another one here. How much should a small company budget for automated services?
Yeah, good question. So as you look at and again, there's a lot of different pieces in there, but as you look at, if you're curious, kind of like, what are, again, time and expense would be part of your automated process out there. But just as you look at a small business, just to give you guys kind of a ballpark pricing figure. So for someone that has, let's say, 40 employees out there that would be using our application for time and expense, they'd be looking at roughly, $10 to $12 per user per month. So let's just say $400 to $500 a month for the application. Now there'd be some initial setup and implementation as it relates to that, but the ongoing process out there, you're looking at roughly $400 or $500. Now, again, as you look at time and expense, now what that would also be eliminating from you is, of course, however much time it takes the person right now to enter that information into an Excel spreadsheet, how much time it takes someone to basically go through and review all those compliances, because we would expect that the application should be able to go through and very quickly see if something is in or out of policy. And then, of course, how long does it take someone to turn around and key that information into the accounting system or the payroll system out there? So as you look at that, a lot of these, there are hard savings and then there's some soft savings out there. And we do have some ROI calculators that we can share with organizations as you look at kind of what that overall savings are. But again, the goal should be that it would eliminate any sort of, mail, people are mailing receipts to the home office and things like that. All that can be digitized these days. So again, it's not a huge expense as you look at it out there. And again, the benefits should definitely outweigh whatever the cost is. And that pricing that I mentioned, again, that's roughly for about, let's say an organization with 40 employees. As you add more users, that per user cost goes down. And I should have also mentioned, typically these tools are going to be deployed in a software service. So it's going to be a monthly recurring fee as it relates to those users.
Awesome, thank you. It looks like that's all the questions we have for today.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for the time here today. I believe my information is shared, so if there are any additional questions that you have or would like to see some additional case studies, you can certainly do that. You can also go out to the Data Basics website, which is www.data-basics.com. We certainly have some case studies out there and some additional details as far as how non-for-profits are leveraging time and expense tools. But again, I want to thank everyone for their time here today, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you, Chris. This workshop has come to a close. All materials from recordings will be available on our website. Thank you so much for participating in From Virtual to Events and More, the top trends in time and expense management and what nonprofits need to know in 2021. Again, thank you, Chris, for educating our community.
Thank you.